Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU presents the H3O Art of Life show. The title of our show is Unreality History. You'll learn more about that as we proceed. My guest today is Hunter Haviland Adams III, and I'm introducing him as not just the author of a book, but the author of an idea about which you will hear a lot during this show. One of the things that Hunter has said in his book, which I'm paraphrasing now, is until the lion tells his own story, the hunter will always win. Hunter tells it differently. He says, until the lion has his own storyteller, the hunter will always tell the story. So we agree that the lion needs an authentic version of the lion's story told from the perspective and knowledge of the lion and experience. So I just wanted to say that because I wanted to before we got into his reason for having written the book, which is going to prove to be somewhat controversial, I'm sure, I wanted to read what I gather is his reason for having written the book, although he does give his reasons. And he's given us something from the wisdom from the ancient Maadic ethical tradition, 2000 before the Christian era. And it's Sarujta. And what it means is to restore that which is damaged and destroyed, to raise up that which is in ruins, to set right that which is wrong, to replenish that which is lacking, to strengthen that which is weak, to make flourish that which is lifeless, making it better and more beautiful than it was before. And that, to me, Hunter, is your intention for having written the book.
Absolutely.
So now we will look at a story that Hunter will read to us, and then we will actually get into what he's calling the 4 functions of his book.
Thank you. It's great to be here again. I really love being on your show, and I get stopped by people everywhere to praise this show.
Oh.
They make it a point of watching whenever it airs, Friday and Sunday, because you have so many interesting, fascinating, and amazing guests with incredible things to say, all for the elevation of our communities. And so I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be here today and to share what I'm sure will be a very interesting topic. And so to get started, I've written a poem, and the poem will be in the book. And a poem is simply entitled A Story. Stories are powerful. Through stories, reality is constructed and maintained. Different stories have different consequences, and some can change the game. Some stories contest other stories. Others become true, repeated again and again. There's a story we've heard all our lives, but it's a story filled with living lies. It's a story unchanged in 1,000 seasons and validated with 1,000,000 reasons. It's a story that traumatizes as it trivializes a people's desecrated dignity. It's a story of false beginning and failures never ending. It's a story that frames our fears and drowns voices we don't want to hear. It's a story of shifting shame and guilt from ill-gotten gains. It's a story making invisible our rightful identity and code switching a survival necessity. It's a story as convoluted as a conspiracy theory, yet birthed the blues as a respite for the weary. It's a story written to keep our real spirit out of view. It's a nefarious narrative where history is intentionally skewed. Hence, this is the danger of a single story. Yet hidden in plain sight is the backstory whose truth is being brought to light. But to get our story straight, we are called to fight.
Well, now you're a poet in addition to all of the other wonderful things that you do, and I appreciate that. That's a very good opening to
Well, I've been a poet all my life,
Well,
really.
you never read any poetry to
I
me.
got a lot of poems that I've done that I will publish soon.
Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to talk about the idea, the book.
We're going to talk about the idea.
Okay, let's talk about the functions. Let's talk about the reasons that you give in your book for why you are doing this work. The first one is to delegitimize and de-reify the terms slave in quotes and slave trade also in quotes. In other words, to move these words from the common ground to the background, make their use uncomfortable, and take the ideas which these words raise and represent off the table. To conduct a social autopsy. I've never heard of a social autopsy on what really happened during the transatlantic slave in quotes experience and its aftermath. To examine the oppressor's, that is to say the slave in quotes trader's brain, including complicit Africans. To offer strategies for healing humanicide, the term I submit to better describe the totality of this 5-century crime against humanity. Now, these are the functions that you have given. I wanted to ask you to define reification. So that it becomes as common to us as the reality shows of the housewives from the different parts of the world.
Right. Well, to reify a word simply means, to make that word a reality, right? Once a word gains currency in use over time, and this word over centuries, it becomes a reality. But the reality it becomes is like reality TV, as you said, that it has no legitimacy of its own. It's like Malcolm said that, we've been hoodwinked. We've been led astray.
We've been bamboozled.
We've been bamboozled by this term. And it's extraordinarily offensive to me, more so than other words which we've been called out of context that have no reality either. But this word is such a powerful word. It's so powerful, Dr. Peace, that a friend of mine who is from Colombia, I asked her, and by the way, they may put up the title of the book cover. It's called We Were Never Slaves. Very simple. We were never slaves. Now people are going to ask me, how did you come to write this book? What does this mean? And I'll get into that. But let me just say this, because I think this is very important and it really captures the gravity of this. I asked her, how do you translate, I'm going to mess this up, how do you translate into Spanish, we were never slaves? And she said, Nostras nunca fuimos esclavos. She said, but because whenever we see the word esclavos or slaves, we know automatically it's referring to us as African descendant people. So we don't have to say we. I said, wow, that's how embedded the term is. I mean, there's other people who historically, quote, have been indentured servants and so forth and so on. But when they see the word esclavos or slave, they immediately think exclusively of Africans. That gives us a sense of how deeply embedded this is. The word is problematic on a whole host of accounts, which I talk about. So my effort in this book is, one of the things, is to delegitimize the word. Because when you say slave or slavery, for example, both of those terms advocate a number of things just by saying the word. When you say slave or slavery, one, it advocates non-personhood. It advocates non-possibility. It advocates non-liberty. Just by saying the word. It's embedded. These are the functions embedded in those terms. It silences the subjectivity of the person. We've never seen depictions of Africans depicting themselves in the experience that they were going through in the 1600s and the 1700s. So we don't know what they looked like because there's no images drawn from their perspective. So their subjectivity is silenced. And that's the purpose of the word. It whiteouts, or some would say it redacts, the history of a particular person or the kinship group which they belong. You know nothing at all about who they were. Was it a man, a woman, boy or girl, grandmother, grandfather, artisan, woodworker, king or queen, prince, herbalist? You know absolutely nothing about who they were because it whites that out and in turn fabricates a false history that you're unintelligent, you're stupid, you're thuggish, and a whole host of stereotypes.
That you're anonymous.
That's what I said, silencing is making you anonymous.
Right. Well, let me just, I don't want to interrupt your train of thought so that you don't follow where you want to go, but I do want to say that, you know, early on you said that this arose from your rejection of the concept. You refused to accept that our ancestors were slaves, and that resistance caused you to begin to explore. I had a similar experience when I started to teach, and I saw that all the history books, all the social studies books, showed us as adults in chains walking down the gangplanks of slave ships. Where had we been before we were adults? Right. Where had we been before we were on those ships? Right. Where had we been before we were in those chains walking down the gangplanks? So it always makes you wonder, well, how much has been, as you say, whited out? How much has been held back and suppressed so that we cannot see these people except some anonymous black adults who were walking down a gangplank in chains on their way to auction blocks to be sold into plantations to work for the betterment and the welfare of other people. So when you started from there, that was a legitimate question to raise. Right. To resist and to reject the notion that this was the common experience of our ancestors.
I think your audience needs to know what that experience was, and it goes back to being a child. And I was raised on the south side of Chicago. My church was Salem Lutheran Church. And I can remember going to Sunday school one day, and a white boy said, "You people are just like the Hebrews in Egypt." Now his sentiment may have been innocent, but the 10 Commandments had been playing. And obviously we see the Hebrews toiling under the Pharaoh's thumb and so forth and so on. And so our Sunday school teacher, grandmotherly teacher, wonderful person, Mrs. Esther Dixon, saw sadness on my face and said that God loves you and I love you. And as a gesture of assurance, she asked me for my picture. And later, when I gave it to her, she placed it in her Bible and says, "You're going to be okay." But that feeling, that gut level unease haunted me all my life. And so it was that visceral rejection that my ancestors, my people, were not like the Hebrews in Egypt. We weren't slaves. And things just built, I've written a lot of things and the ideas were always there, but they didn't really congeal until I was asked to, things had congealed and I gave a lecture to Millikan College, and there was faculty and students and administrators there. When I announced what the title was, folks said, "What? This guy must be crazy. He must be like some historical revisionist trying to revise history like a Holocaust denier," and on and on and on. But I anticipated that sentiment. And I just asked them, I said, "Okay, I appreciate, your feelings," because it was all on their faces. I said, "Just wait to the end and then judge me, then judge my proposition." And by the time I got to the end, heads were nodding, there were smiling faces, and people had agreed. Faculty said they found my argument compelling as well as convincing from that. And so that's how this project began. It was really just an article, although it was an article that, the topics I had covered, over 2 decades. And then I had another friend, her name is Ari Hennett. She's a psychologist and does a lot of great things. And I was just casually mentioning, the things that I was working on, because I was working on a book on Africana moral idealism about Ma'at and other systems similar to that. And also a science of consciousness, because that's one of my things, is trying to figure out how our brains work. And I just casually mentioned this lecture that I gave. And she said, "What? That has got to be your book. That's the book that'll help us heal. That's the book that'll be a paradigm shift." This is what she said. And she hadn't heard my whole lecture. I just shared a little bit. And so from that, just everything just started coming together. All my ideas congealed, and that's how this book came about. But I want to be clear, it's for a general audience. It's not for specialists necessarily. And so that's a challenge for me to write for a general audience, because I'm more technical and scientific in my writing and want to document everything I say and have notes and a long bibliography. Well, I will have that. But that's basically how this book came about. And it's been a passionate pursuit ever since.
Well, you talk about dubious and dangerous moral values, and that's point number 5. But what you had asked previously was questions about how could God-fearing and religious people and religious institutions show no compassion for the practice that you have given its proper name, but was formerly known as slavery. How was it that this could be carried out in the presence of people of conscience, or we like to think they were people of conscience? How was that possible?
Well, it's the same kind of question that we ask of any atrocity, whether it was happening in Rwanda or in Cambodia with Pol Pot or Stalin or Hitler. It's the same kind of question because, you know, I mean, there are Buddhists, and Buddhists are supposedly are nonviolent, but, you know, they engage in some very violent acts, you know, albeit, you know, maybe because oppression, you know, mandated that type of response. But in this case, we have to deal with a very inconvenient truth, and that is the God of Abraham didn't see anything wrong with slavery. And a number of 15th century popes didn't either. In fact, they went so far as to write a number of papal bulls or authoritative documents to give theological and moral cover for these traders, these business people who were doing that. And that's an uncomfortable truth. I mean, we have to really look at that because it's very difficult. But one of the things that I raise in this book is the battle for the book. The battle for the book. There's another component of the founding of this country, was the battle for the book. Who was going to control the printing, the selling, and distribution of the Bible? Because before, when people say I have the authorized King James Version of the Bible, well, that just simply means that yours was sanctioned by those English translators underneath the King James at the time. And interestingly, that when in the late 1700s, the Patriot colonists, they said, why do we have to buy Bibles from you? We can print them here in this country under our authority. We don't need your authority. And that created another conflict, and which the British ended up losing, of course, you know, because, you know, that's how we became a country. But what that allowed for was the deliberate political mistranslations of, quote, the word in strategic sections, strategic chapters. You know, I'm not going to go over all of those now, but I will say when you read in Ephesians, slaves obey your master, in the King James Version, in other earlier versions, it was servants obey your masters. Because the word havid, which means servant, and the servant had a range, a constellation of meanings. It can mean servant of Yahweh, Elohim, Adonai, whatever name of God, you know, that it's referring to. It could be servant of the king, servant of your mother and father, your parents, servant of whoever you're working for. So it had a constellation of meanings. It didn't mean, quote, slave. One, because the word didn't exist at that time. There were no Slav. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself here.
I'm trying not to.
And the Greek word, doulos, the same thing. It had a constellation of meanings. And so when you insert a recent word to describe bondage and indentured servitude, it was to clarify the status of the captives to the colonists, their owners. And so they changed servant, both in Greek, doulos, Hebrew, avid, to slave, to morally and theologically give cover, at least they thought, to justify, to rationalize this criminal enterprise. And so with that, it became easy, or easier, to wink, to look the other way. Well, these aren't really people. But even the Constitution couldn't say that we weren't people. even the Constitution, its birth defect, which the former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, calls it, not me, the 3/5 compromise. But even there, you don't find the word slave in the Constitution. And so that was, again, a way to make us anonymous, non-entities. And you only say persons or these people or our people when it was necessary to be more definitive. And so, I mean, these are some of the things that I'm looking at here in this book. And so it's going to be difficult, particularly the section where we look at what really happened.
You know, when you have that section, you know, I've been looking at it with the eye of an editor, and you have what really happened as though it is a question, because it's followed by a question mark in your table of contents. And I want to just put a period there. What really happened? Because you're not asking a question, you're answering a question. And you talk about disappearing acts, you talk about the long march, dungeons, demons, and the door of no return. And I capitalized the, because the door, that door is like, that is a proper noun. That door is a specific door.
True.
It is like no other door. And you might want to talk about that a little bit, about just that, the phase one of this journey.
Well, I can never forget my first time going to Dakar, Senegal, and taking the short boat ride to Gorée Island, which is where one of the dungeons or holding facilities to hold the Africans who had been marched to the coast, to hold them in preparation for their transport to the Never Never Land, which they knew absolutely nothing about. And I can always remember going there, going in, and when I got to that door of no return and looked out at the Atlantic turned red as blood. And I wasn't hallucinating, it was in the daytime, but that was my experience. And everyone that I know that's gone there, or to the castles in Ghana or Sierra Leone, they've had similar experiences that, I'm sorry, but the smell of dried, dead skin and blood is embedded in those buildings. It's still there. And when you look out at the Atlantic, you know that your ancestors would never ever see, at least the vast majority, would never see their particular homeland, their community, or anything again, because they didn't know where they were going. And that was the beginning of the trauma. Well, the trauma of being marched, but that in preparation of boarding these ships, floating prisons, voyages of unbearable sorrow and suffering. It's just unimaginable. We can't imagine that. We think about the miners in Chile, and I was one of the ones that watched that rescue, as did maybe a billion other people, that they survived for 17 days in absolute darkness. But they could move around. And eventually someone, you know, once a hole was drilled, they had food, they had water, they had a radio that they could listen to. But if you were in the bowels of one of those ships, then there was no place for you to go. And that trip, depending upon the time of year, the winds and so forth, could take from 4 weeks to 9 weeks. It all depends. And we can't imagine the diseases which the people were afflicted with and had to survive with to make it to these shores. You know, even the crew members on nuclear-powered submarines, it's a common fact that being in the submarine, that they come down with a number of respiratory illnesses. You know, even breathing the clean air, even the air is being filtered. Still, many of the crew members come down with a number of illnesses. They come down with claustrophobia and other psychiatric conditions, which they learn how to manage. But this ship was nothing like that. There was no place to go. You couldn't move around. You were forced to lay in your own excrement or next to someone who had died. Tom Feelings, in his book, Middle Passage, does an excellent job, I think, in trying to graphically convey what that was like. None of the films, Sankofa, Roots, the mockumentary Goodbye Uncle Tom, none of them can depict what that was like. Just that phase of this experience was like. They can't do that. They can give us some sense. But I think we have to have an accounting on what really happened. You know, for example, Oscar Brown, peace be unto him, with his incredible song, Bid 'em In, Bid 'em In.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Can you imagine you getting off of a ship and then you're put on a block naked and someone is taking an auction? You know, you don't know what this is. You just see hands go up. Yeah, I'll say so and so and so and so. You don't have no idea what that is.
And someone is probing your anus. And if you're a female, somebody's probing your vagina.
Right.
And they are feeling and patting and probing to find out if you are sound enough to buy like you would buy livestock.
Right. Right. And so, but the real thing, which I call brainwashing 1.0, was seasoning and silencing of the soul. And that is, in Roots, when Kunta Kinte is asked his name, and he kept saying Kunta Kinte, and he says, no, that's not your name, boy, anymore. You're no longer Kunta Kinte. What is your name? And he just, days went by, and he kept saying Kunta Kinte, but finally the beatings.
And he cut off his foot.
Right. He finally said, my name is Toby. That's seasoning. That is seasoning. No other people that I'm aware of in human history underwent that, just that aspect of, quote, slavery. What we commonly think of slavery, someone, working and not being paid, or even the African version of being put into someone's family and you're serving them tea, or going out collecting wood or whatever, or water, just to serve that family, and you become part of the family. This is very different. And that's the thrust of this whole section, is that we don't really have a clue of the totality of what happened. And so that's why I make an effort to explore these things, to explore the silencing of our souls, our subjectivity being written out, being made anonymous, that you don't have a voice.
That you don't have a personhood.
You are a non-being. You're a non-entity. What other people have had such an experience? Is that, just that?
And then you have For the Love of Money. For the love of money.
Breeding babies.
Babies.
Breeding babies, being forced. Women are forced to be raped, to be impregnated by anybody multiple times, including the owner.
And his brothers and friends.
Entire family, all of that. But we have to remember that, you know, we only think of slavery or the plantations in the South, quote slavery, but we know New York, Connecticut, Delaware, you know, the whole eastern coast. There was no plantations there, but there was work to be done. And some of the most hideous brutality. There's a quote that I found in a book in my father's library called Black Bondage in the North, where they would inflict all manner of torment possible on the Africans there, particularly if they were rebellious, particularly if they ran away and were caught. All manner of torment possible, including being burnt at the stake, including being put in an oven, specially constructed ovens, and burnt alive, including put on a skewer and roasted. Someone is turning the person.
Like a pig on a spit.
As if they would be turning a pig. This is what was going on in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut. You know, sometimes it was for crimes allegedly killing a white person, quote, white person. Other times, they were just in the wrong place in the wrong time, at the wrong time. And so we have to look at all this toil, torment, terror, trepidation, and tribulations. And this was taking place everywhere. So, you know, the whole notion of the Willie Lynch syndrome, you know, I don't think it ever existed, although there were documents.
A Willie Lynch.
There were documents that speak about all those things. But that doesn't capture none of this. It doesn't talk about silencing your soul to make you anonymous. It doesn't talk about the ethical evil that's part of the federal constitution and state constitutions, all the laws that were created specifically to manage and coordinate our non-existence, African people's non-existence. And those laws are still on the books. There hasn't been a movement to have those laws nullified. They're just not enforced. They're still on the books. The black codes are still on the books today. And so people in the South, in the governments of South Carolina and Mississippi, say, well, slavery and segregation wasn't Diddy, you know, quoting Haley Barbour, the governor of Mississippi. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't, well, for him and his ancestors, he's right. It wasn't that bad.
Is it correct that the state of Mississippi was among the last to ratify the Emancipation Proclamation to abolish slavery, to take some legislative act against the slavery?
I believe so.
Well, that's my information. But the Emancipation Proclamation, the so-called, now that's a word that needs to be in quotes, emancipation proclaimed.
It was proclaimed. Lincoln did not, quote, free any slaves. Someone can't say, okay, here's this piece of paper. Okay, this paper says, you free now. You free, Dr. Peace. Well, it wouldn't be doctor then, but you free.
Mm-hmm.
Can a person's humanity be defined by what's on a piece of paper? That I'm going to write this law, this amendment to the Constitution, okay, now we got papers on you that says that you're a United States citizen. The paper says you can vote, even though women still couldn't at that time. But that's absolutely ludicrous. A piece of paper cannot define my humanity. A piece of paper cannot give me my humanity that I never lost.
And moreover, a piece of paper cannot consign you to captivity. It took a lot more than a proclamation to usher in that era known as the transatlantic. That
Right.
wasn't a piece. These were acts, terrorist acts, by deliberate terrorist acts, by people whose intention was to take and hold captive masses of African people. They didn't serve them with subpoenas and
Oh,
say
no.
report to the door of no return. There were no papers exchanged. By brute force, with the use of military might and also the cooperation of some of the religious institutions,
Right.
with their consent and their cover and their justification, and they're looking the other way, and their missionary efforts to convince people that they were unworthy of being human, that they were in fact savages, not even 3/5
Right.
of a man, but some sort of subhuman.
Oh, Glenn Beck even went further, said, well, it was a mistake for there to be a 3/5 compromise of them being considered as 3/5 a person for voting sake. Really would have been better if they were non-persons, then their freedom would have came faster. I know that these are the type of arguments that we are having in the age of Obama now. That it's okay to make some of the most ludicrous and ridiculous, vile and vulgar statements about history, to fabricate history. And that's what we see taking place today.
What we see taking place also is what George Orwell called doublethink, that people can manage to maintain two opposing ideas simultaneously without there being a contradiction between the two of them.
Right.
So we have doublethink and doublespeak, and we have unreality being represented as reality.
And being normalized.
And when you said reified, immediately I thought of the most obnoxious term, minority. How in the world have we come to accept that abstraction as a reality when people of color are 9/10 of the people in the world? You could never be, if you are a person of color, you could never be in the minority in the world or any place else that you happen to be on the earth, because you are still a part of that group. Whether you are physically in that place or not, you are part of the majority population of the world. And so for us to accept as people of color that we represent some sort of minority, even some political independents would say there are more black people in the city of Chicago than there are Italians. There are more black people than there are Irish people. There are more black people than there are any other ethnic group in the city. So we are not a minority when you call things by their proper name. But we have the abstraction minority has not only been used to falsely label the people who are in fact the real majority, but it has been strengthened and made it become such common currency that the people to whom it refers are accepting it. When you hear the indigenous people call themselves Native Americans, how can they be Native Americans? They were here before there was an America.
That's right.
So they're accepting, the whole idea is you call them Indians. That was a reified term.
That's right.
Because this was not India. They didn't refer to themselves as Indians. They were the Iroquois, the Choctaw, the Chippewa,
Hopi,
the Arawak.
Right.
Okay, so they were people who gave themselves their own name, and the place where they lived its own name. It was not America. They were not Americans. So when you made this land America, what you still had was some indigenous people who were native to the land that preceded what is now America. But this is the unreality history that you are speaking to, that you are challenging when you say, I want to go to the etymology of this word slave. Right. Where does it come from?
Well, I mean, anyone with a reasonably good dictionary, or if you don't have a dictionary and you have some internet schools, you can just Google or whatever search engine you choose, slave, comma, origin. You can do that. And what you'll find is slave being synonymous with an entire ethnic group known as Slavs. So you said, now that's interesting. How did that happen? That was the question that I had. How did the name of an entire ethnic group become synonymous with bondage, the brutality of bondage, with indentured servitude? And that's really a complex history, which, we don't have time to talk about now, but, folks can certainly read about it. But we find that prior to roughly the 5th century, as a large ethnic group, the Slavs did not exist as a large homogeneous ethnic group. Because you have now, later on you had Eastern Slavs, Southern Slavs, and Northern Slavs. Northern would be like Ukrainians, Bulgarian, Russians. Southern would be Romanians, Czechs, and so forth. But all of those groups weren't enslaved. At different time periods, certain Arabs, certain Greeks, certain Jews purchased them as mainly war criminals. I mean, of people who had lost the wars, prisoners of war. Because there was lots of wars over this 1,000-year or so period. There was famines that took place. So there was a lot of things that happened. The boundaries of specific countries changed. And so it's really hard to track down the time frame of when exactly this occurred. But it seems to have occurred via the Arabs or the Moors in Spain. And I will flesh that out. That's being fleshed out more in the book. But the point is, once you know the origin of the word, you can't retroactively and say the Hebrews were slaves, because there were no Slavs in Palestine. You can't say the Hebrews were slaves of the pharaohs because there were no slaves in Egypt. Slavs didn't exist. But that's the trick that's been done, to take this word slave and retroactively apply it to every historical circumstance of servitude, no matter what type of servitude it might have been, but to apply that word retroactively back. And that doesn't work. Because the people, the Slavic people, they had their own terms for indentured servants. In the Czech language, in the Romanian language, in the Turk language, in the Russian language, they had their own terms for indentured servants. And it wasn't Slav. So someone put that on them. And unfortunately, that wasn't something that was dealt with in the Velvet Revolution, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. But now we find that you can't find a country with Slavia or Slovenia as a suffix to its name. No more Czechoslovakia, you have the Czech Republic. No more Yugoslavia, you have Bosnia, Serbia, Herzegovina, That's gone. And so that's another reason why, and Africans didn't come from the Balkans. We didn't come from that region. We weren't put on boats and shipped across the Baltic Sea and then marched across those other countries. So we're not Slavs, we're not slaves. That's just another reason for that.
So obviously when you begin to remove, when you uncover the fact that here is a misrepresentation of history and the truth, and that we are calling some people by the wrong name,
Right.
we're calling some practices by the wrong name, we're calling some processes by the wrong name, then obviously there is a name, a true name, not a pseudonym, but a genuine name that identifies these people. And you have found the true name that should have been used all the time. And thus you have found the true process and practice that was practiced against
Right.
these people.
Right, because part of the thing that, because people don't like the term slave. Even today, it's easy to hear people say, well, we weren't slaves, we were enslaved. Something was done to us and it didn't reflect our humanity. It made us a non-being. And so people reject the word slave.
And it's humiliating.
And it is humiliating.
And it shames people unnecessarily.
Right. And so people say, no, we were enslaved. I said, but just putting the prefix in doesn't change anything because you're still using the same word. And so a lot of people say, well, this was genocide. Well, genocide is a technical and legal term that states debate whether or not a situation such as in Sudan, in Darfur, would be called genocide. That you have to have a legalistic term outside of a normal war. That's why it took so long for Rwanda to be declared genocide. And so there's a lot of machinations which determine whether or not something can be called genocide. But genocide basically means killing. The killing of a people, a select group of people, killing them. Well, the objective in our experience wasn't to kill us, it was to humiliate us and for us to do the work.
And to dehumanize us.
Exactly. So some have said, well, like Dr. Bobby Wright said, this was menticide, was to try an attempt to convince us that we weren't human beings. And that's a good term, but menticide only captures a part of
the
it.
mind.
That's it, not the totality of what happened.
Well, you got 4 minutes.
Okay, and Marimba Ani uses the term the Maafa. A Swahili word means the great disaster. But when you say great disaster, it doesn't say what the disaster was in the word. And there's no African word that can properly define what this is. So last year, it came to me that really what happened when I started looking closely at genocide, at ethnocide, and the dimensions of them, a lot of things that they left out. I said, this was humanicide. This was an attempt to kill the personhood and possibility of a people, to kill their social existence and their efficacy, attempt to kill their spirit so they would no longer be the human being that they were. And so we look at, there was historicide to create a false history. There was linguisticide to prevent you using your own languages. There was political dimensions of genocide, that you can no longer self-define yourself as a body within your own space. There was economic humanicide, because there's an economic dimension, and on and on and on. So all these things taken together captures, I think, more definitively what really happened.
So these are real human beings,
Right, and so
not slaves.
no, we never were slaves.
We were human beings upon whom the practice and the process of humanicide was initiated and continued.
And it still continues. It's morphed into other more subtle forms like racism, for example, like micro insults, microaggression, things like that.
Low intensity aggression.
Low intensity aggression, psychological warfare, COINTELPRO, the mass incarceration of black men, which Michelle Alexander talks about in her book, The New Jim Crow. And so there's so many ways that this process still continues, that the brutality is no longer physical, it's psycho-spiritual, that people are caught up in the social narcotics of religion and can't see their way out. Now, I'm not condemning that, but I'm saying that you have to look very closely in those texts to see how are you being misused. If you're using a Bible where it says slaves obey your masters, you should throw it away, because that is not the right translation. If your pastor is using such a Bible, you need to tell him or her that this is incorrect. We have to find ways to heal. We have to mourn. We have not mourned these losses of the millions of people at the bottom of the Atlantic, the millions of people who were eaten alive by carnivorous animals on the Long March. We haven't mourned all the ancestors which allow us to sit here today.
And the title of the book is
We Were Never Slaves.
We Were Never Slaves by Hunter Haviland Adams III. Your argument is compelling and convincing and controversial for some people.
It sure will
and
be.
When may we expect to be able to read your book?
I expect it to be available probably in the late spring, and you can go to my website, wewereneverslaves.com, or hunteradams.org.
This has served to just confuse us.